So this is my location, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I'm Oscar Koeroo. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for the ministry. Yeah, so this is, to me, it's new, because typically I lurk the streaming service from the other side, and now I'm in the room, so that's a bit different here for perspective. So I'm on IRC for quite a while, lurking mostly, but I worked at NICF, but then on the laboratory side from 2003 to 2013. Then I worked at KPN in the CISO office there, and now for 2 years I work for the ministry. And we had some learnings to do, because typically we worked with, of course, hardware security modules in specific areas, or outsourced even in some cases. But ultimately there was a motivation to learn very quickly in a very small amount of time, and I'm going to tell you something about that. So our ministry, of course, is for public health, so we're here for you. We work for you as civil servants. And we have all kinds of variations of services. And we could basically boil this down that we have your informational or special healthcare related information multiple times in various databases, or pharmaceutical information, you name it. Everything that has to be behind the scenes, not at the hospitals, but everything that we have to do centrally, we are responsible for that, and we take very great care in doing this, day in and day out, with great engineers. Now, there are all kinds of threats these days, hardware, software, and especially if you think about a Meltdown and Spectre, and you can see all kinds of other pieces of software, or sometimes my colleagues would say, that's a piece of hardware, for example, or Fortinet or Citrix, but they don't really look always at the software side and the threats on that end. And I look on the inside, and I regard a Citrix as a BSD device with software. At that time, it had some quality issues. So at least in hardware, we see the same kind of threats. And we see attackers becoming very sophisticated and getting into the machines and getting into key material. Now, this is something that happened in the past a few times, over and over again. So even if you have such a responsibility and you have encrypted data, that's all cool and nice. But if you have all your data in memory or in environment variables, and the environment variables leak out, we had some issues with some great large vendors having such a situation where log files ultimately had key material in the logging because something went wrong in that area of the software. That's a problem. How do you protect against those kinds of situations? How do you protect against the developers making, of course, I'm a software developer myself. I know how much mistakes I create. The C compiler has been very strict to me in the past. Minus strict. Or pedantic, choose your poison in that case. But that's basically what I've been growing up with, so I know all those kinds of things. So how do you protect even when the attacker is on your system, in your system? What are the opportunities? Now, if you look at secure connections, I always keep up this drawing that I've made in the past, which is, okay, you have to think about TLS connections. This is what I typically work with, or at least most of the times. And you have to deal with the confidentiality part, so you have to encrypt the data, you have the integrity control, and authenticity. Now, today we're going to focus on the authenticity side, because if you mess that up, somehow, at least something goes terribly wrong. This is why I'm pretty fond of destroying self-signed certificates wherever I can find them in infrastructure. It's too tactic to actually not ever have that problem. But I always have the explanation, look, if you have a connection from one to the other end, how do you know if you're connecting to the actual server that you're basically targeting? Now, we just had an explanation about SSH and SSH keys and the quality of keys even over time. Now, this is something that we have to take care of course, but what if the keys are self-signed and there's not a fingerprint control, PKI, for example? There are quite some risks in that kind of field. So we have to be very careful in how to deal with those keys and ensure that if you have a PKI system, and I assume you all know what PKI is, so don't have to explain that, but if you have a system which is basically pointing down to just a few keys, and if somebody has a possibility of creating new keys, new signatures, you basically break down the entire security system from one little hack. And this happened in the past. And this is something that we have to ensure that will never happen. So if you look at certificate chaining, then of course you have, just for resemblance, you have the certificate of the host. But if you have the signing scheme, then basically everything starts from the other end. You have a root CA. The root CA then, of course, signs another certificate for purposes of distribution and business continuity management. You have multiple layers of signatures. And that key signs another CA, in this case an extra subordinate CA, and then ultimately you sign your host certificates. This is PKI in a very small nutshell. This is what you see. So if you look at the coloring scheme of, in this case, a macOS, for example, it says, well, this is how the distribution of keys and certificates is being handled, and you've got this root CA. Now, if you have a root CA, you can generate a new certificate and fake a new identity. Now, identity faking is not just something for humans, but also for machines. So if you can fake a machine's identity, that's pretty bad, and you can do all bad things with that. I think we, as internet society or internet community, we don't have to explain what you could do if you can actually fake a connection, and if you can do interceptions and so on. This is a really bad thing. Now, how do you take care of that? Well, we also have to take care about the keys on our hosts and services. Because if you look at CAs, those use hardware security modules to protect them and ensure that people are not able to get a hold of the key. But then I always look at my own configurations, for this case, a piece of Nginx from my home lab. And then I look at the device and I say, I always have my keys ready to go. If I want to do a system control restart of Nginx, I want to load that key, right? Because otherwise, if the machine goes out, power goes in, I need to unlock it with a PIN code. Well, that's going to be a problem. So sometimes we have an issue with a protection with hardware security modules that's really complicated to solve. How do you ensure in these kinds of fields that you always continue your operation? I have my keys on, wait a minute.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Sync?
Okay.
I saw it on here. I did not see this. Sorry. So this is what I was talking about. Where do you store your own private keys? And we know that we have to protect the private key, right? Typically it's on disk. Now we have to type in a password. Now if I reload my web server, I don't really want to type in my password. Now how do I protect this against a threat that comes into my host, on the host, has abilities of reading the entire file system, and grabbing my keys, grabbing my digital identity of this host, and then continue on. This is where hardware security modules comes in again. Again, explanation will come after that. What are these kinds of devices? Yet another set of pizza boxes in this case. Here's a quite variety of some various models and makes. I didn't want to push into one specific vendor, but in this case you can see quite a few models. They don't really distinguish that much from any other 19-inch racked mount devices. On the inside, at least before you go to the inside, thank you for the Crypto Museum, by the way, is here the first indication that this server might slightly be different than another one. Because if you want to service your memory modules or anything else that breaks, well, one of the typically what you do is you pop open the box, new memory modules in, and you're done, right? Well, you should, but in these kinds of cases, that even is a protected seal. And the idea of this entire mechanism is that you can store the keys on the inside of the box. You interact with the box, you have an authorization protocol going on, and you ensure that nobody else can go into that box. So one of the things that a hardware security module is also protecting you against is actual physical threats. In this case, by a very classical seal. This obviously has no actual protection against it, but the thing is that you want to see and ensure that somebody actually went into the box. So sometimes with hardware security modules you would say, well, I could enter the box and I'll take over the machine. Well, the idea is that at least sometimes it might be tamper-proofed, but there are various grades in hardware security modules. And one of the first indicators in this case is that you have a seal that you can see that there is a breaking and entry. And you have a very positive statement, this actually happened. On the inside, you will see yet another great example of the Crypto Museum. You will see that it's just a regular machine. It's not that special, actually. Of course, all the devices and all the elements of a hardware security modules are tested for radio emission, even with somewhat stronger protocols than you would typically have, to see if you can actually read or catch memory material or some other activities from the outside of the box. This is why these devices are certified for those kinds of electromagnetic threats. But this is just the outside of it. The actual hardware security module is just this. It's interesting to see the lag, by the way. So the hardware security module is just this thing. So the entire box is certified and basically holds a front display. You can interact with the device, and from the outside of the box, you can start interacting with the operating system on it. And through that interface, you can see the inside of this. Now this, as you can see, is a very sealed up piece of hardware. On the inside, you should see this as cells. So there are many cells, blocks of memory, and each of the memory blocks can be authenticated with a PIN or some other means of an authentication mechanism. There are various ways. Typically, you would say that the cheapest and more common way is that you have some kind of a PIN code for an administrator or for a user PIN per cell. And the cells are typically fixed sizes of X amount of bytes. This depends on the model and so on. So you have now an authentication mechanism of stating, okay, with the proper PIN, you can now get a hold or at least interact with a cell. There's another rule of hardware security modules. You cannot walk yourself with software inside of the cell. You can only interact with the door. The door has rules. Rules like you can create a key on the inside of the cell. You can remove or purge or delete a key on the inside of the cell. You can only have a bit of a through hole or looking hole, how do you call that, when you just have this little trap door that you can just put the food in. In this case, the food of the cell, of the hardware security module, is the data you want to sign. So you throw the data inside of the cell, you state to the outside door with a special knock, I want to have an RSA signature, and you have the private key on the inside, please sign. Then you sign the key, or in this case you use the key, sign the data, and just the signature pops out of that room again as an empty tray. That's the thing what you could do with, for example, secure signature generation. The other thing that you could do is, what else could you do with the data if you have a private key? How much of a crypto nerds are you guys? If I send data to a server, I have the public key, so I have the public key. I send data encrypted with the public key, so I can now decrypt data, right? So if I have the private key, I can decrypt data. Now, how do I decrypt data with a hardware security module? In this case, you could enter the data, or at least the ciphertext, throw into the jail, in this case the cell, You throw it in, and it has the private key on the inside, so the plain text can come out. These are some of the methods that you could do. Now, data that you could throw in could also be time-stamped. For example, these days you have GPS satellites. Older ones don't have any time-stamping and signatures. Nowadays, time is being time-stamped and signed as well, to at least have authenticity on time servers. You can imagine what could happen in a war situation if you fake GPS data. Same kind of mechanism applies to all things that we use with HSMs. Now this is one HSM. This is a certified box. This is a certified thing. As you can see, it's sealed. And the idea and the other concept is the data will be destroyed faster than that you can tear off this piece of metal and get on the inside of the silicon. That's the idea. That's the concept. Now, of course, you see all kinds of researchers scraping off the top side of silicon to get to the key material, This is why there's a metal box on top of it, so that that ensures that the epoxy on the inside, if you tear it off, would probably break the chips on the inside faster than that you can do that experiment. That's the concept. Now, this is one example, and there are multiple examples of chips and hardware security modules probably closer to you as well. Think of your banking transaction, SIM cards, and even these kinds of passes or identity devices where you have a chip on board and where you can have and store key material with the same concept. You can interact with it, but you can never get the private key out. You can interact with it, you can do the special NOG, you can sign, you can decrypt. Those are the primary options that you have with a device like this. And it works exactly like such. The idea is that the private key will never come out. That's the truth thing. Huh? You actually give the physical device, in this case the Rijkspas, you give it to the person, and that's the identity that you first have to vet and check. But there are many forms of hardware security modules. The other option that you could see, or at least that you might even have worked with, are OTP-based, where you have a system where the private key is on the inside, but now there's an algorithm going based on time and giving you PIN codes every so many seconds or minutes. Same concept. Private key will never come out. The idea is that the device will break and the private key will break faster than that you can actually scrape all the silicon and plastic off. And on the other side, you see, in this case, a bunch of varieties of YubiKeys where exactly the same thing goes on, and there are higher level protocols built on top of that. And there's many of those examples. Passports, for example, has a chip on it, and it is near-field communication, yes, but it has a cryptographic protocol with it so that it secures the line and then interacts with the onboard system itself. And there are varieties of options where this is built into your motherboards. And this is basically what, well, Apple, Samsung, choose your destiny with respect to the devices. Apple, even all kinds of Dell systems have been built with those kinds of chips very early on. And this is what is now also being woven into the ecosystem of cloud providers, for example. If you have an identity and pieces of the identity or even keys for hard disks can now be stored on the system motherboard, where the idea is that it is tamper-proof. And the system itself is then interacting with the key or key material and then passing that key material to a hard disk, or it does the signature scheme and you have a private key on the inside of a TPM chip, and the private key is then being used to authenticate you, or at least authenticate the laptop that you've just authenticated with your identity. So your identity and the laptop's identity are now being tightly bound and can then be used to authenticate for M365 services, for example, or any other service. It could also be tied to GPG signing, which can be helpful if you sign off and not just use SSH to interact with GitLab, GitHub, whatever, but also use the GPG key to sign off that these are your check-ins. It's very interesting to actually see that, not just to use GPG and signing, but also sign that off with hardware-backed keys. Extra assurance. So yeah, some of the key features. On the inside, it runs Java most of the time. Okay, personal opinion, I hate Java. I'm really a C programmer. I live with Python these days because it's easier doing C. But yeah, it runs Java and you can basically customize anything on it. So that's also a bit of a misconception. Oh yeah, but this is always tied down and so on. No, these are kinds of Java modules that you drive. So the Java crypto engine that you use on your systems, a embedded version, is being used on the inside of these chips. Which means you could typically also create your own type of interactions and protocols if you wish with this system. Which also holds for the HSMs, by the way, not just for your passes and so on. So again, I've already mentioned key operations. At least the simple versions are create, delete, rollover of a key, sign, and so on. Data handling, decryption, signing, that's it. And all other things are typically protocols that are built on top of these primitive operations. Typical interactions with those are PKCS 11, so which natively works with, for example, any SSL library that basically supports this, which is nice. Long live open standards. KMIP, XKMS, sorry, which is also an open standard, which is you can basically, so if you have a CA, for example, and you want to do more interactions and you want to also work with roles, like, okay, but you are the operator of the HSM, but you're not the key owner, and you have to authenticate, and you have to have multiple people in the same room. Now, this can be expressed with more complex protocols. This is what you're trying to do here. And the example of YubiKeys, for example, then you see other protocols working in interaction with the hardware security modules on the inside of a YubiKey, which would then end up in protocols like web authentication. Now, there's many certifications. There's FIPS 140-2, and there's now -3, which is an upgraded variety and common criteria, which is more common in Europe. Now, the certification schemes is something that is really important, or going to be quite important soonish, I guess, if we want to go to a post-quantum crypto world. Then I assume that there will be a certain amount of time where new protocols come in. They all need to be certified at the same moment in time. What will happen? We will probably denial of service all the certification bodies, because it takes typically 4 to 6 months per device type to be certified if all the protocols, all the emissions, electronic emissions in this case, all the certifications, all the authentication schemes, if everything is working right, including all the cryptographic protocols on the inside of the machines. Because, well, it's running a crypto engine on the inside, of course, inside of each of the cells. Now, this is something that needs to be probably challenged up for the next 2 to 5 years, when we probably will see all these devices being certified for the new protocols. So, hold on for that one. So, and the FIPS levels are interesting. So if you look, it's always explained wrongly, it's FIPS 140-2, or in this case -3 for the modern version, and then level 1. This has basic security. So basic security means it has an authentication scheme on the outside. You can't just enter the box. There's one operator typically, and this is how you handle these kinds of devices, right? Level 2, it shows evidence of tampering. Now, this could be a seal, this could be something else, it could be the metal casing on top of the HSM card, and if you rip it off, then it should definitely show something. So the metal on the outside is typically very soft, so it dents quickly. If you touch it too hard, then basically you're tampering or breaking the entire tampering evidence mechanism if you mishandle this one. Now the next layer is this is the level 3 is typically what CAs are using on the outside world, because, well, it adds also multiple operational roles. You can state there are many key custodians. For example, you could say there are 10 key custodians, and I need 3 of the key parts to actually reassemble one key. This is typically done, or at least in most systems, there's a scheme called Shamir Sharing Secret, triple S scheme. It's the same Shamir from RSA, by the way. And he thought of a very simple math problem where, at least if you state you have a key, you split the key in 10 parts, and any of the 10 parts, if you say, well, I have a rule that I need 3 parts at least to reassemble the same key, I get the same AES key. It's pretty neat. You can do this in Bash, by the way. We've tried that. It works. For the people who really like that. But you could do it. It's an interesting scheme. You could also split with that scheme, by the way, you can also split your own keys if they're even not working in this system. But on the inside of these kinds of boxes, this is why you also see the multiple colors. It's not really good to see, but you see these key fobs. Those are not USB devices. Those are, well, in this case, probably the interface probably is USB, but don't treat it as USB because that will be horribly wrong, probably. But there's a blue, a black, a green, and a red one. I'm not really sure what the green one was, but at least the blue ones in this system for SafeNet is that you are a key custodian. So you could have at least 10, or maybe you bought 20, but at least 10 you've given out to 10 colleagues, different people. The black one is the system operator key, and the red one is the admin key, and the green one probably the recovery key, but the green one I'm guessing. So if you want to have a key ceremony, you will probably have, if you state it is the policy to have 3 key parts out of 10, then there was a setup moment in time when you had the 10 people giving the 10 key parts, but when you have the CA ceremony, you're creating new keys, you're signing something new, you're creating new data, or in this case new key material on the inside of the cell. Each time when you work with that, you have 3 blue keys on the table. And one of the black keys, at least for the operator mode, so that you have an operator operating the HSM. And the cool part is, that means you have at least 4 people in that room. 3 key custodians, 1 operator doing the things, and when you have a key ceremony, it should at least have 1 or 2 witnesses, perhaps even an observer. And this is what you typically would require for a typical key ceremony as a minimum amount of people for a new key that you would create for a CA. This is what I've seen and observed as one of the internal CAs that I've created at KPN, for example. This is how we dealt with that situation. So that's something as a feature you will only get from the layer 3, and the layer 4, more. And this will also ensure that there is even more probabilities of detecting it. So you can state that if, so sometimes these devices are also equipped with temperature sensors. So if it heats up in particular areas of the device on the inside of the box, then an alarm will go off, those kinds of things. Now, I also want to stress out, if you really want to work with this technology, it's cool that you have key material, hardware security modules, YubiKeys, whatever, but it basically boils down to a nothing, worthless situation if your total level of assurance is basically 0 because you have no idea who you actually gave the key to. Or if you have a key acceptance situation that you have no clue who you've actually accepted the key for or public key for. This is something that I see happening quite a lot, where you have a statement saying, oh, just like with SSH and fingerprint, the first thing that I type is yes. Yes, but was it the actual box that I was touching? Is it the box that I'm actually administrating? Well, in some cases it depends. Perhaps that would be the attacker intermediate to the actual box that I'm servicing. How do I know? Well, this is where you need to vet identities for machines and humans. Perhaps in that order. Now, this happened. This is basically also one of the, so this is a bit of the closing thing, so I'm gonna kick 1 or 2 minutes. So we had this little bit of a crisis with this virus going on, this biological virus, not the ones that I typically am working with. Yeah, and basically they stated, create 2 contact tracing apps. Okay, how do we do that? Now, you've probably seen all the news about that. But we've created these 2 apps, which is the Corona Melder and the Corona Check in the past. And both of them had all kinds of key material and cryptographic things going on. This is also why you had for the Corona Check, the QR code business, there were 2 QR codes. There was one very large QR code and there was the smaller QR code. And the larger QR code, the one with more data in it, had more key material and less personal identifiable information. This was the Dutch mechanism. The other one had more personal identifiable information, which was the mechanism used in the EU and beyond the EU actually. But all the data that we've stored and all the parts that we don't really have to store, most of the system is just a signing operation system. All the signatures went through an HSM, or at least a key signing mechanism, and everything was HSM backed, which was quite a bunch. Now the Corona Melder was really something that was created really fast, and all the other systems, we had to develop it really fast, and there was only one solution to do it open source, fully. So including all the cryptographic things, everything, if you want to have a dive in what type of mechanisms that we've used, everything is published on GitHub for the Ministry of healthcare, Min VWS. We are a very strong supporter of August Kerkhoff's, at least Kerkhoff's principle, in saying that the keys should be very safe and secure, and the entire mechanism should be fully open as much as we can. No exceptions, at least we hope no exceptions. We haven't seen any exceptions so far. Any other exceptions will be prudent and stated, this is not an exception required, please publish this too. So even the cryptographic analyses are published. And we've even used, one of the hackers who actually thought of the idea of using a YubiKey as an HSM in operation. We couldn't buy the HSMs. These are very tough devices to actually get a hold to in a very small amount of time. So one of the tricks was to actually use a YubiKey as an HSM, and this is what we've actually used, and it worked very darn good. On the other system, the Corona Check, we had a bit more time, and this is where we had a park of 5 HSM devices. This is also basically because of that experience that through an intern that I had at NICHEF, I got a hold of a contact at RIPE, and RIPE people stated, hey, we're working with HSMs, or we want to use new systems and consider new opportunities for our PKI. And I thought, oh, those are cool things. The HSM thing, the cryptographic thing, and RPKI is cool. And one of the things that I basically helped with is that there is a lab in Leeuwarden of the government where we had a lab of HSMs. Now this is something really, it's really odd to actually have. It's very complicated stuff to have. Then have somebody who have an archaic knowledge about HSMs for so many years. It's interesting to see, and this is what I've helped with, and this is why I have a RIPE shirt, because, well, he brought me a RIPE shirt, and I work, sometimes for kudos and t-shirts. So yeah, so are these hardware security modules perfect solutions? Well, yeah. Yeah, so this backstory that I heard from people who were actually very near to that situation is if you leave all the keys every time on the devices, in the devices, and basically you've unlocked the device where you would say, enter PIN, you enter the PIN, then leave, go for coffee, and have a field day for next month. And then you get hacked, and that gets combined into this. This is basically what DigiNotar is in 2 sentences. Thank you.
Thank you, Oscar. I would imagine that there will be some questions for Oscar.
Go ahead.
Well, maybe I was just imagining. I hope not. There is a question from the socials, I guess.
Yes, we have a remote participant, Wouter Prins, asking, if you have multiple HSMs serving the same goal, how do you distribute private keys?
It's interesting. I just had a talk. What was the name? What was the name of the person that stated it?
No.
Oh, sorry, maybe not. Okay, so it could have been. It's interesting. I just talked about exactly this situation and how to deal with that scenario this morning when I was at Sloterdijk still, and I saw some old colleagues from KPN walking over, doing crypto. So there are a few options to do this. The answer of the private key and getting it out, sometimes there is a very secure escape hatch. This is where you need to have all the key custodians and the operator and so on at the same time. So sometimes there are options to escape a private key if you really wish to. But it needs to be set up as such, and if it's not set up and certified to never ever do that, this is why you need audits. There is a motivation for audits. This is one of them. If you want to state that private key exportation is never possible, you have only one option. You could buy exactly the same hardware security module and the special cable typically, or something else certified, and you could have one cell. Basically, it's if you have a jail, like a jail cell, and basically you have a jail cell, but then fully interconnected. This is just like the ET scene. You know the ET scene where they have all kinds of tubes going and that the alien will never go out? Basically, that kind of tubing is what you do to the other cell of the other HSMs next to it. So you could create a private key and it will never leave out of the context of the HSMs, but it will then be certified, connected to just the other HSM of the same type of model. So if you see an HSM and you see only one, and there's not a brother or sister HSM in the other data center, you have a business continuity management issue because those keys will die when this device breaks down because everything breaks. But there is an opportunity to back up the keys to another HSM. Did not anticipate that complicated question, but good one. Very good.
Any other questions in the room or from the socials?
Saw a hand over there, but not really sure. Yeah.
Could you? I know it's a hassle, but could you please go to the microphone for the benefit of the many online viewers?
Backing of private keys on the inside of the HSM is a pain. So one of the tricks that they do when you set up a system is you can pre-populate them with keys, not really assigning them to a certificate, for example, having the pre-populated keys, do the magic with multiple HSMs, have all the keys to the other device, and then you distribute the HSM to multiple data centers, and then put them in operation.
Yeah, a question about the YubiKeys being used to sign the Corona app. How many YubiKeys did you have to use to actually get the performance to sign all of those QR codes?
Well, the QR codes were not signed by the YubiKeys. This was the backup of the keys that they required for. So basically, you have a key on a key on a key sometimes, signed by or enveloped trick. One of the keys, at least that was the root for the Corona melder, so this is not a QR code solution, was on the YubiKey if I'm not mistaken. There were other applications which were also very important. There were 20 or somewhat unknown applications. Everything is open source, you can read the code. But all those other applications used, at least in the early things, used the YubiKeys to back up their keys. And the other things, yeah, those were Itimacos, two of them in a data center, 2 production, 2 acceptance, 1 testing.
Okay,
we still have those. It's interesting to actually have spare HSMs. Prototyping. So if you have ideas and want to prototype on an Utimaco, have a call.
There's one final question from Robin. Knowing you, you will probably be asking about the do-it-yourself solution now, right?
You're absolutely correct.
Okay.
About the YubiKeys, I've got a spare one lying around in my drawer.
Yeah.
If I want to improve the security of my own private keys, is that possible? And where do I start looking?
What do you mean? Do you want to clone them between the two, the private keys?
I currently have my private keys somewhere on my computer.
Yeah.
Which is somewhat secure. If I want to improve my security and I have a spare YubiKey lying around, is this possible with open source software? Where do I start looking?
No, because the YubiKeys are typically set up in such a way that you can never export the private key, so you cannot clone them. But look, this is a picture of yesterday night. No, 2 days ago. So this is my setup. I've got, you don't see them. So these are my keys, and I've got 4. That's because I know I should have 3, but I have a spare. And the black one, for example, always stays home, and the other one's always at me. So this is how I basically deal with that. And then the services, like for example, let's say GitHub, for example, is pretty well known. I just load in multiple keys and then have my business continuity management with having multiple keys that could each of them break down and not have a sweat. That's my solution. Hardware backed, but I need to back up the keys into, in this case, discrete 2 private keys, and I have to assign the 2 private keys to me and my account.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Oscar. We have a small present for you for your presentation.